He flirted with her like it was a game, a rich man's charm against a tired waitress's silence. His friends watched, amused, sipping wine as if her dignity was part of their evening's entertainment. But what none of them knew was that the woman they were mocking would soon stand where their power meant nothing, because the girl they called just a waitress was more than they could ever imagine. And before the night turned into morning, the billionaire would be standing in court. Ella Carter had been working at the Silver Oak for almost a year. She never planned to stay this long, but life had a way of stretching promises. Every night she arrived before sunset, changed into her uniform, tied her hair into a neat bun, and reminded herself that this job was not her destination, only a step on the way. The smell of roasted garlic, polished wood, and expensive perfume followed her everywhere inside the restaurant. She had learned to move fast but stay invisible. That was the rule here. Guests didn't like to be reminded that someone was cleaning their mess. She was 25 and studying law during the day. Most people didn't know that, and she preferred it that way. To them, she was just another server carrying trays, smiling for tips and pretending not to hear rude jokes. But every plate she served was part of a bigger goal, one that kept her from losing faith in herself. She wanted to become someone who could fight for people who didn't have a voice. Every long shift, every night she stood until her feet ached, felt like an investment in that dream. The Silver Oak wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place where the city's most powerful people came to show off their power. The lighting was soft, the tables sparkled with crystal glasses, and every waiter moved like a trained actor in a silent play about wealth. The laughter from the upper-class guests often sounded rehearsed, full of self-importance. Ella had seen people throw away food that could feed families, argue over wine brands like it was a matter of pride, and treat the staff like background decoration. But she never lost her composure. She needed this job. That evening, the manager looked more nervous than usual. The staff whispered that an important guest was coming, someone rich, famous, and proud of it. The name traveled through the kitchen before the guest even arrived. Alexander Pierce. Everyone knew who he was. A billionaire investor, the kind of man who could buy half the city if he wanted to. The manager gave strict orders that everything must be perfect. He asked Ella to handle the table personally because she was the most patient one on the team. She didn't take it as a compliment. She knew what it meant. She was good at smiling through disrespect. When Alexander and his friends arrived, the entire atmosphere changed. The restaurant seemed to grow quieter, even though their laughter was loud. They walked in like they owned the place, and maybe they did in a way. Alexander was tall, confident, and too used to being admired. The men with him wore expensive watches that flashed under the lights, and the women looked flawless, dressed in designer gowns, their heels clicking across the marble floor like punctuation marks to their laughter. Ella watched them take their seats at the corner table with the best view of the city. She took a deep breath, picked up her notepad, and approached. She could feel their eyes on her before she even spoke. It was a kind of attention that made the skin on her neck tighten. Not admiration, just curiosity mixed with judgment. She gave her practiced smile, polite and calm, and began taking their orders. They were already half distracted, talking over her, treating her presence like background noise. She had been through this before. It still stung, but she had learned not to show it. From the very start, she could tell Alexander liked attention. His laughter came a little louder than it needed to, his stories a little too polished to be natural. He kept glancing at Ella between sentences, like she was part of the evening's amusement. His friends noticed it too. Each time he looked at her, their smiles grew sharper, waiting for him to turn his charm into mockery. She had met people like him before, men who believed their money made them more interesting. Ella returned to the kitchen several times to bring food and drinks, and each time the group grew louder. They weren't cruel in an open way. Their words were dressed as jokes, but underneath them was the same message she had heard before: "You're below us." They laughed when she misheard one of their requests. They commented on how calm she looked, as if calmness was something they could buy. They made her repeat orders just to watch her react. She didn't. She stayed steady. The restaurant was full that night, every table busy, but time slowed around theirs. She could feel the heat of their attention every time she came near. She wanted to disappear, but leaving them unsupervised would get her scolded by the manager. So she endured. Her posture stayed straight, her voice even, her movements precise. She had learned that dignity wasn't in silence, it was in control. Some of the waiters avoided the table. They didn't want to face the group's taunting remarks. The manager pretended not to notice. Rich guests always got special treatment. Ella was alone in that corner of noise and perfume and fake laughter. Inside, a small fire burned quietly, a mix of frustration and pride. She refused to let them see they were getting to her. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, she could hear their conversation drift from business to gossip to shallow compliments about themselves. They treated her like an audience for their achievements. Each time she passed, Alexander found a way to make her pause a little longer, sometimes asking a question he didn't need an answer to, sometimes commenting on her appearance with the smooth tone of someone used to being obeyed. She answered only when necessary. Her replies were short, polite, and professional, but she could tell he didn't like that. He was the kind of man who expected people to react, to laugh, to be flattered. Her calmness made him uneasy. That only encouraged him to push more. His friends joined in, turning every small comment into a joke. They talked about how hard some people must work for a living, how noble it was to have a simple job. They never said her name, but the target was clear. Ella kept her eyes on the tablecloth, not on their faces. She had learned that sometimes looking away was stronger than answering back. Behind the counter, Maya, her co-worker, whispered that she should switch tables. Ella shook her head. She didn't want help. If she ran away from every unpleasant guest, she would never learn to stand her ground. Still, her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the next tray. Hours passed like that. The music changed, dishes clattered, laughter rose and fell. The group grew more relaxed, more careless. They spilled a drink once, and instead of apologizing, they joked that she was lucky to have something to clean. She crouched down quietly to wipe the floor while their laughter rang above her. The humiliation was quiet but sharp. When she stood up, her knees hurt, but her pride hurt more. She wanted to say something, but she swallowed the words. She needed the job. Rent was due next week, and her textbooks still weren't fully paid for. She told herself that silence tonight would buy her a future tomorrow. Alexander seemed to sense her restraint. He watched her as if trying to figure out what kept her from snapping. There was a strange spark in his expression, part interest, part irritation. He wasn't used to people staying calm when he tried to provoke them. That made him want to test her more. By the time dessert arrived, Ella was exhausted. Her back ached, her head felt heavy, and she could barely keep her smile in place. She didn't even notice the manager watching nervously from across the room, afraid one wrong look might upset the guests. He valued tips more than dignity. When the group finally asked for the bill, she felt relief so strong it almost made her dizzy. But before she could walk away, she heard them laughing again, louder this time, at something Alexander said. She didn't catch all the words, only fragments, something about waitresses with dreams, something about knowing their place. She froze for a second, then turned her face away before anyone could see the shine in her eyes. She handed them the check with steady hands. The manager hurried forward, smiling, trying to flatter them. Alexander didn't even glance at him. His eyes were still on Ella, calm and curious, as if wondering how much it would take to break her silence. She stood still, waiting. Her face showed nothing. Inside, however, her heart was a storm. She had spent years believing that education, patience, and hard work could earn respect. But nights like this made her question everything. Still, she didn't let the bitterness win. She held on to her calm because that was her armor. When the group finally stood to leave, they left a large tip on the table, almost too large. The manager was thrilled, praising their generosity, but Ella didn't touch it. To her, it wasn't kindness. It was pity wrapped in arrogance. She left the cash on the tray and walked away to the back room. In the quiet of the storage area, she let herself breathe for the first time that night. The noise of the restaurant faded behind the door. She looked at her reflection in the small metal fridge. Tired eyes, messy bun, uniform creased from hours of work, and felt something inside shift. Not anger, but something colder. Determination. She wasn't just serving tables. She was learning how the world worked. Who thought they owned it and who was strong enough to rise above it. She didn't know it yet, but tonight was going to change everything. By the time she clocked out, the restaurant lights were half off. She placed her apron in her locker, washed her hands, and looked once more at her reflection in the small mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but there was something steady in them. She wasn't broken. Not tonight. Not ever. As she left the staff room, she heard Mr. Collins laughing with someone near the entrance. When she stepped closer, she saw him standing with Alexander Pierce. He had come back. His suit jacket hung loosely now, his tie undone. His smile was lazy, confident, and something in it made her stomach twist. Mr. Collins introduced her again too eagerly, telling Alexander how hard-working she was. Alexander's eyes stayed on her the entire time. He said something polite about excellent service, then looked at her in a way that felt like a test. There was a silence that didn't belong in a workplace. Then he said, almost playfully, that she should join them for a drink. Mr. Collins laughed like it was a compliment. Ella didn't. She said she still had work to finish. Alexander chuckled, not used to being turned down twice in one night. He said she took things too seriously, that she should learn to relax. She simply said, "Have a good night." "Sir?" and walked away. The moment she disappeared into the back, Mr. Collins's voice dropped low, telling her later that she should be more flexible with important people. It was meant as advice, but it burned like a slap. She didn't answer him. She just went to the staff room again, changed quickly, and left through the back door. That night, she couldn't sleep. She replayed the laughter, the mocking glances, the spilled drink. She thought about all the other waitresses who smiled through the same things every night. Somewhere between anger and exhaustion, she realized she didn't want to keep surviving quietly. She wanted to change something. The next morning, sunlight cut through her small apartment window. Her alarm buzzed beside her law books. She had class that day, and later, an internship shift at the city courthouse, a position she had earned after months of studying and interviews. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the closest she had come to her dream. When she walked into the courthouse, everything felt different from the night before. The air here was calm, serious, respectful. People spoke softly. Every sound, footsteps, papers, doors closing, carried meaning. Here no one cared about clothes or perfume or how much money you made. Here, only truth mattered. Ella greeted a few familiar faces and went straight to the records room to prepare files for an important case scheduled that afternoon. The clerk handed her the folder with the name printed clearly on the cover, Pierce Industries versus State of New York. For a moment, she froze. The name hit her like a cold wave. Alexander Pierce, the same man who had mocked her less than 12 hours ago. She blinked hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Coincidence, she thought. Maybe someone else with the same name. But when she entered the courtroom later that afternoon, carrying a stack of legal documents for the presiding judge, her mother, Honorable Judge Margaret Carter, the truth became undeniable. He was there. Alexander Pierce sat at the defense table, surrounded by lawyers and assistants, his confidence filling the room just like it had filled the restaurant. His navy suit was pressed, his hair perfectly styled, and his smile was back. The practiced one, the one that usually worked. But when his eyes lifted and met hers across the courtroom, the smile faltered. For a second, he looked like he had seen a ghost. Ella walked straight past him without expression. She placed the files on the judge's bench with calm hands, then stepped aside to take her place near the clerk's desk. She didn't look at him again. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any confrontation. Judge Carter entered moments later, her presence commanding instant respect. The courtroom rose, then sat again. Alexander straightened his posture, clearing his throat, trying to recover his composure. But his eyes kept flicking toward Ella, disbelief tightening every muscle in his face. No one in the room knew what had happened the night before. To them, she was simply the judge's assistant, professional, composed, and focused. But for Alexander, every second felt like punishment. The same woman he had mocked in front of friends was now standing beside the one person who could decide his fate. As the hearing began, the room filled with the sound of papers turning and lawyers speaking in steady tones. But beneath it all was a quiet tension, an invisible shift of power. For once, Alexander wasn't in control. He tried to focus on the case, but every time Ella moved, handing a document, whispering to her mother, adjusting her notes, he flinched. The contrast between last night's laughter and today's silence was too heavy to bear. Judge Carter reviewed evidence, asked questions, and took notes, unaware of the storm brewing behind her daughter's calm expression. Ella kept her face neutral, but inside she felt the sharp edge of justice, not revenge, but something deeper. She hadn't planned this meeting. Life had done it for her, and she decided to let truth do what pride could not. When the prosecution presented security footage from one of Alexander's offices, the USB drive slipped from the folder onto the desk. Ella picked it up and placed it carefully near his lawyer. Her fingers brushed the edge of the file, and for a brief moment, Alexander looked at her again. This time there was no arrogance, only realization. It wasn't the waitress standing there anymore. It was someone stronger, someone who had seen both sides of power and still chose dignity. The hearing continued for hours. By the end, Alexander's confidence had thinned. The judge announced that further investigation was required into his company's conduct. The room began to empty. He remained seated for a moment, staring at the polished wood of the table, his reflection faint and uneasy. Ella gathered her papers silently, her expression unreadable. As she passed him on her way out, she didn't slow down, didn't glance sideways, didn't speak. But something in her calm posture said everything words could not. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. They didn't yet know who she was, but soon they would. The news would travel fast, about the billionaire under investigation, the case that caught him off guard, and the mysterious courtroom assistant whose quiet strength had unsettled him more than any lawyer could. When Ella finally stepped outside, the sky was turning gold. She took a deep breath, the city noise rushing back around her. For the first time in months, she felt lighter. She hadn't shouted, hadn't argued, hadn't humiliated anyone. She had simply stood where she belonged, and the truth had done the rest. Inside the courtroom, Alexander sat still, watching the door she had walked through. The memory of her voice, her steady eyes, her calm refusal. It all came back like a slow echo. He realized too late that respect couldn't be bought, and that dignity, once mocked, could return with the full weight of justice behind it. News anchors spoke her name like they had always known it. Photos from the restaurant leaked. Blurry images of Alexander at his table, laughing, glass raised, with Ella standing beside him, face calm but eyes steady. Someone from the staff had recorded it. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of shock. Within hours, it spread across social media. Waitress humiliated by billionaire now seen standing beside judge in court. People replayed the clip again and again. The spilled drink, the mocking laughter, the moment she quietly cleaned it up without a word. Comment sections filled with strangers defending her, calling her the symbol of silent strength. For once, the world sided with the quiet one. At Pierce Industries, phones rang non-stop. Investors called for explanations. The board demanded damage control. Reporters gathered outside the company building, microphones raised like weapons. Alexander Pierce, who had once believed his name could silence any scandal, now found that it couldn't even silence the truth. He tried to issue statements, public apologies, carefully worded press notes, but nothing felt right. Every word sounded smaller than his mistake. His friends stopped returning his calls. The same people who had laughed with him that night now avoided his shadow. In one viral clip, a journalist asked him, "Do you regret what you said to her?" He looked down, eyes tired, voice quieter than ever before. "Every word," he said. That was the first honest thing he had spoken in months. Meanwhile, Ella stayed silent. She didn't appear on TV, didn't give interviews. She still went to the courthouse every morning, head held high. Her uniform now a simple suit, her hair tied neatly instead of the messy bun she wore at the restaurant. Her mother told her the world would try to turn her story into headlines. But she must stay rooted in who she really was, and she did. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ella stopped by the Silver Oak again, the same place where everything had begun. The lights were softer that day, the laughter quieter. She wasn't there to serve anymore. She just wanted closure. The manager, Mr. Collins, looked startled when he saw her. His nervous smile said everything. He tried to apologize, stumbling over words, but Ella stopped him with a small nod. She didn't need his apology. Sometimes forgiveness isn't spoken. It's simply moving on without bitterness. She sat by the window where she used to clean, watching new waitresses move about, smiling, tired, determined. She wondered how many of them carried silent stories like hers. She wanted to tell them that strength didn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it meant surviving without losing your heart. As she got up to leave, she noticed a young girl at another table drop her tray. Glass shattered. People turned. Someone started laughing. Before the laughter could spread, Ella walked over, helped the girl pick up the broken pieces, and said softly, "It's okay." The laughter died instantly. It was a small act, but it carried weight, a quiet echo of a night she would never forget. Outside, the evening air felt cooler. Streetlights flickered on one by one. She took a deep breath and looked up at the courthouse tower in the distance. That building had once felt unreachable. Now it felt like home. She smiled faintly, not the smile of victory, but of peace. Weeks later, the case concluded. Alexander Pierce faced legal consequences for fraudulent activities within his corporation. His assets were frozen. The same man who once thought he could buy respect now signed papers under the very system that Ella had devoted her life to. When his lawyers brought him the final documents, he paused at the signature line. There, in bold official letters, was her name, Ella Carter, Junior Legal Associate, authorized by the court. He stared at it for a long moment. The name felt heavier than all the wealth he had ever owned. In that instant, he understood what power really meant. Not control, not money, not fame, but integrity. Something he had never possessed, but she had carried effortlessly even when she was sweeping crumbs from his table. He signed the papers quietly and left the courtroom alone. No cameras, no applause, just silence. Months later, Ella stood at the edge of a stage, diploma in hand, her mother watching proudly from the front row. She had graduated from law school with honors. The audience applauded, flashes went off, but her mind wandered back to that single night. The restaurant, the spilled drink, the laughter. That humiliation had been her turning point, the spark that pushed her to become everything they said she couldn't. After the ceremony, she walked outside into the open air. The city buzzed with life, cars honking, children laughing, the world moving on. She smiled again quietly, not out of pride but gratitude. She had learned that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And when it does, the whole world listens. Somewhere in a dimly lit restaurant, another young waitress wipes a table, holding her breath through a rude customer's words. She doesn't know Ella personally, but she's seen her story online. The one where a waitress stood up without raising her voice and changed the power dynamic of an entire city. Maybe tonight, that girl will go home believing that her dignity isn't small, that one day the same hands that carried trays could hold something greater. A book, a badge, a gavel, or the truth itself, because sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones destined to rewrite its rules. And that is what Ella did. Quietly, completely.